Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Georgia Tech welcome to a notable philanthropist, social entrepreneur, and profound gentleman, Mr. Alexander Rossides.
Thank you, Shabani. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So I really appreciate being invited to speak with you today, and you've had a lot of illustrious speakers, and so my background is modest in comparison, but I think the topic is quite important, and it may be somewhat new to many of you. It's a different approach to solving our society's toughest social problems, and within that discussion there'll be lots of other subtopics that we can engage in. Before we jump in, though, first let me just get a show of hands. How many students here are undergraduates? Just raise your hand. And keep your hands up if you are business majors. Okay, raise your hand if you're other students in the audience. Right. Adults in the audience. Not that you're not adults, but okay. So that helps me just have a sense of your backgrounds. Let me jump into our discussion by giving you some background on the topic we're going to discuss. So, can a philanthropic capital marketplace solve social problems? So let's just define a little bit of what we mean by that title. I'm going to ask you, and anybody, what do you think we mean when we say market? What do you think of, what's your definition of a market? Anybody? Excellent. So a place where buyers and sellers come to do business, or as the Webster Dictionary said, the area of economic activity in which buyers and sellers come together. And that's actually the definition that we use, my organization and the many people that we work with. So you can think of a stock market, or you could think of a flea market, right? It's coming together. So what do we think then of a capital, or what a capital marketplace is? Well, it's a place where investors connect with investments with companies, right? So that's a capital marketplace. People who want to invest money in companies connect with companies, and they fund and finance them and buy a piece of them. And you've got a lot of different ways to do this in the for-profit sector, right? You're familiar with the venture capital field. There's early stage funding and private placements, which is companies get a little bit larger and they need bigger rounds of funding, $50, $100, $200, $500 million. They go to an investment bank. They have a business plan. The investment bank takes that private placement memorandum and shops it amongst very well-endowed funders, pension funds, hedge funds, et cetera. Or you have stock markets, right? Once you become very large, blue chip companies, you know, they're listed on the NASDAQ, on the New York Stock Exchange, et cetera. So that capital marketplace is a system. There are different stages of funding in that system, but it's a system. It's got standards, it's got rules, it has certain laws and SEC rules, and depending on where you are in the development of your company, you have access to capital at different stages. And if you're in different industries, from technology to health, et cetera, you have different avenues in those areas for funding. So a philanthropic capital marketplace, similarly, is simply the idea of philanthropic funders connecting with nonprofits, right? And the philanthropic funders generally are two sorts. Foundations, which is akin to your institutional investors in the for-profit sector, and individual donors. Individual donors can be massively high net worth folks, like the Gates Foundation pledge folks, billionaires. They can be down to the smaller donors. So let's just talk about the word solve for a second. How many people think we can solve social problems? Completely solve them? Okay, good. I need idealists in this room. I use that word to be a little provocative. When you see the size and the magnitude of the problems facing us, it is quite difficult to contemplate solving them. Right now we have a poverty level that's approaching 20% of the population. Now, can you eradicate poverty? That's a good philosophical question. And thank you for being someone who believes in that, because you never know what the future will bring. But if we can get it down to 2%, right? That's massive progress. So let's use that as an operating definition of the word solve. So with that, let's talk about social problems. And I'm really talking more about the hardest, toughest social problems that face the country in education, health, poverty alleviation. Within those big buckets, you've got lots of sub-buckets. You know, dropout rates in education, you've got homelessness and poverty alleviation. But the big buckets of deep social service problems. You have other things, environment, et cetera, but those are the ones I'm really talking about today. Let's just look at some of these problems. So, 46 million Americans living in poverty. 1.7 million New Yorkers. You know what the federal poverty level is for a family of 4? Does anybody know? Just take a wild guess. I don't even think I know the exact, but take a order of magnitude guess. Anybody? No, it's about, right, it's about low 20s. Low 20s. Right? For an individual, it is about 12,000. Hard to contemplate a family of 4 living on that amount of money. 1.7 million New Yorkers out of a population of 8 million. That's a city that we all believe has rebounded, hardly even got really knocked down in the Great Recession. What's not talked about is 4 million New Yorkers. 4 million, half the population, lives at 150% or below of the poverty level. For a family of 4, it's about $32,000. You're talking about massive levels of low income and those under poverty. 55 million Americans uninsured. Now, hopefully the Affordable Care Act is going to help a lot with that. You know the implications of that. 1/3 of the nation's 4th grader students proficient in reading. If you're not reading by 4th grade, it's really 3rd grade, you're almost sure to be, let's say it this way, a very grim future. You learn to read by 3rd grade, and then you read to learn after that. The statistics all show. Once you fall that far behind, it's almost impossible to catch up. And therefore, and a third lack basic reading skills, right? So you see the final statistic, 55% of the students of color, right, graduate with a regular diploma. Now you've got hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of jobs available that go unfilled because we don't have the skill sets. If anybody saw the New York Times yesterday or the USA Today, we have the largest discrepancies of wealth that in the last 100 years, worse than the Roaring '20s. If anybody knows the Roaring '20s that preceded the Great Depression. 1% of the population has income levels that account for over 22% of all the income. And the top 10% account for about 2/3. So the question is, I mean, it's pretty obvious, the conclusion, right? We're not making enough progress on these difficult social problems. But the question is, do we care, and why should we care? So you all are here today. Tell me, why do you care about those statistics and those social problems? Anybody? Personal? For the sake of society? Why do you care? Anybody? Or do you care?
Well, we should all care because no matter where you are socioeconomically, you see it and it comes back around. We all live in a community like the city of Atlanta. We have to drive through bad neighborhoods to get to Georgia Tech, even if we live in good neighborhoods, some of us. So there's definitely a merit to saying that everybody needs to contribute.
Who else cares? Raise your hand if you care. And now I know who to call on. Why do you care?
Why do I care?
Yeah.
There are many reasons why I care. Like he was saying, it affects all of us. Social problems around this affect all of us.
It does. It absolutely affects us all.
I'd love to give you a longer answer, but I don't.
That's okay. Anybody else? Anybody else that wants to? Go ahead. Your kids can grow up very well. I just had 18 months ago twin baby girls, our first children, and I think about that every day, every single day. That's right. That's right. It's a rising tide. There are lots and lots of reasons to care, but when you have those level of problems, our collective prosperity is at stake. The country is founded on principles of equal opportunity. When you start getting this level of dislocation and you lose entire segments, generation after generation, there's no saying that we will have a stable future going forward if that continues. The points that people made about, hey, it affects us all because it's a moral issue. We believe in democratic values of a fair and just society and being able to succeed based on your merits and your work ethic. Well, those promises, as you've heard from our president, that fundamental promise is being challenged and is under siege. I personally feel that if we're unable to turn this around over the next 20, 25 years, we will have big dislocations in this country. So it's, in our opinion, those I work with, not just a side issue. And clearly, corporations will tell you, if we don't have a more educated workforce, whether it's STEM, et cetera, we're just not going to be able to compete. There's clearly the economic prosperity argument. So then the question becomes, what do we do about it? So this is the premise number one. Large-scale problems require large-scale solutions. When we say large-scale, we're really talking about solutions that can affect hundreds of thousands of vulnerable individuals and families. We're talking about solutions that can actually get to millions of people, because that many millions are in need. Solutions that help a few hundred are very nice, because everybody's life counts. But they'll never be enough if we just proliferate small solutions. It's like having mom and pop shops forever. I don't know if you can see that. So a Tonka truck next to a skyscraper. You can't build a skyscraper with a Tonka truck. It's the same concept. What we need to be able to do is take those interventions that really work, that have evidence, that have randomized controlled trials that show that they work, and there are not that many of them, and spread them and replicate them. Take your best tutoring programs, your 5 or 10, ones that they've tested, actually teach kids to read. It doesn't matter that you're doing 500 hours of tutoring. It matters if the kids are learning to read and be able to spread and franchise those programs, like a McDonald's, like a Starbucks. There are lots of ways to do it, but I use that as an analogy. The good news, or the frustrating news, we actually know a lot of what works. Solutions exist. I'm telling you, solutions exist to almost every single social problem that you can name. Okay? The problem is we haven't just proliferated them. We haven't replicated them. We haven't scaled them up so that millions can benefit from them. This is a wonderful quote from Elizabeth Shore, social analyst. We've learned to create the small exceptions that can change the lives of hundreds, but we have not learned how to make the exceptions the rule to change the lives of millions. If you have a polio vaccine, the vaccine is one of the areas where we've had success. It's easier with a product solution like that. It's one of the few areas. The polio vaccine was disseminated to all the millions of people who needed it. And my parents' generation, 2 out of every 5 kids or something like that, were affected by polio. Right? There's a moral obligation if you know that a program can teach a kid to read, and if he doesn't learn to read by 4th grade or 3rd grade, he's got very little chance of succeeding at any kind of economic level in life, then there is a moral obligation to spread those things that work. and Bill Clinton, which, you know, as a president, he said, nearly every problem has been solved by someone somewhere. The frustration is that we can't seem to replicate those solutions anywhere else. So the premise is we've got to take the things that work and spread them. In the for-profit sector, that's inherent. You get a great company, a great product, and it spreads. A lot of dynamics at work there that are not at work in the social sector. So the next obvious question is, why not? And just as a point of note, our analysis, and it's been pretty comprehensive, but you never know if it's entirely accurate, but is that one, maybe two organizations in the last 35 years have grown to the point where they are household names. They've disseminated and proliferated their solutions that much. You've all heard of a lot of organizations that are brand names, like the Red Cross, like the Boys and Girls Clubs, like Salvation Army. Those were all turn-of-the-century organizations. They were started in the turn of the century. They were started by the big philanthropists of those times. None others have broken in except for two, and really only one. Happened to be one that you should be familiar with. It's Habitat for Humanity. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but as you'll see later as we get into the capital questions, the person who founded it was a direct marketing genius. And they raised 90% of their money through direct marketing, small, under $20 donations for about 15 years, and they grew. And then Jimmy Carter got involved. The other one, which you're familiar with, is just starting to get there, but it's not a household name, is Teach for America. So why hasn't scale of effective interventions taken place? Here's the key: a lack of capital. We give about $300 billion in philanthropy, right? Very little devoted to scaling up or disseminating or replicating, whatever word you want to use, spreading solutions. Here's why. It takes too much money for one funder. There are a bunch of reasons why, but a main reason. It takes too much money for any one funder. It's $10, $20, $40 million, right, to spread these things. Just in the next round. I'm just talking about, okay, I need the money to grow in the next 5 years, just like a company needs money to grow for the next 5 years, right? No one foundation or individual has enough money to do that on a consistent basis, okay? Even the Gates Foundation, right, dwarfs every other foundation by 8-fold. They don't have enough money to scale up all the kinds of things they want to in education. They were one of our early funders because they said we need a better system. We'll get to that. Foundations are also very poor at collaborating. Individuals are really not good at it because they have their own individual passions. They want to fund what they want to fund. They want to fund a wing of a building. They want to fund a certain disease. They want to fund a chess program because they love chess, whether or not it actually helps the kids graduate or not. And more than half the donations are small donors, and they get just spread out, and half the money goes through, which is not a problem. It's important, religious organizations and diseases. But what you don't have is collaborative capital. And you need it because the amounts of money are so large. So essentially, everybody's following their own strategies. It's a completely fragmented field of giving. Whereas in the for-profit sector, people don't care if they're the 50th silent partner in an investment deal if they think they can make money. So co-investment is just an obvious natural part of how capital markets work. When Goldman Sachs does a deal, guess what? They may be the lead, but JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley are in on the deal. And then they go out and get all the other co-investors. It doesn't happen in philanthropy systematically. Jeff Braddock is the CEO of a group called Bridgespan. It's probably the leading management consulting firm in the nonprofit sector. Time, funds, and imagination are poured into new programs that at best reinvent the wheel, while the potential of programs that have already proven their effectiveness remains sadly underdeveloped. Everybody is funding smaller, innovative programs because they don't have enough money to fund the bigger programs. So if we're going to actually get this done, we need a system, a collaborative system of funding. in essence, we need a philanthropic capital marketplace. None exists today. So this is really a systems change challenge. So just imagine this for a second. Imagine 20 to 30 of the top foundations in the country in education, and another 20 to 30 in health, another 20 to 30 in poverty. I mean, the biggest ones, Rockefeller and Ford and Gates, etc. Imagine if they would actually come together and say, you know what, we're going to form a lead funder group. We're going to be the lead funders. We're going to fund a lead funder. We're going to be a lead funder group. And we're going to agree on how we're going to evaluate and assess funding opportunities that can scale up. In other words, we're all going to agree on the same framework for analyzing our investments. And we're going to agree to criteria. And then we're going to agree to selecting a dozen, and then more year after year, of these investments each year. And we're going to guarantee we're going to put in at least a third of the money. So if it's a $21 million raise, they agree they're going to put in at least $7 million. So a true lead funding group made up of the most respected foundations who have years of experience in these fields. Then imagine that they had a group of a couple of hundred, let's say it's the education lead funder group, that they had a couple of hundred other foundations or philanthropists that they knew they could go to as a kind of first look funder group that really buys into what they're doing, that said, look, we're not going to be on your lead funder group, but we're going to be ready for you, so bring us these opportunities, and they put in another third of the capital. And then imagine that you could take those investments in the form of business plans, like they do in the for-profit sector, and share them with thousands of funders, big and small, who are connected online, that have bought into this way of donating and contributing philanthropic dollars, so that you can go out to thousands, working with networks that are already out there. Right? There's a network for grant makers in education. There are lots of industry networks. There are even networks for individual donors interested in education that they have bought into receiving these investment recommendations. And then imagine that, in essence, you're replicating a private placement model, right? Private placement model. Imagine for these opportunities, say 100 a year. It takes you 3 months to raise the capital for each of them. Just imagine that for a second. Right? Here's the vision. Hundreds of initiatives funded annually in education, health, and poverty, thousands of participating foundations, thousands of individual donors, billions in philanthropic growth capital, and then billions in government and business capital. The government and the business sector will always dwarf the amount of money in philanthropy. But if philanthropy can help lead and show government, these are the top-notch models, then you have a real opportunity to move government dollars to highest and best use. And businesses will support, because it's in their own self-interest to have an educated workforce. That's the vision. And so, let me just go back for a second. Thousands, critical mass is necessary. Otherwise, you're not going to get enough funders for any particular deal. You need liquidity. That's what markets are all about. You've got to be able to segment. You can't bring an education tutoring opportunity to somebody who funds health things. And you can't even bring it to someone who funds education if they don't fund tutoring. And you can't bring it to someone who funds tutoring if it's not in Atlanta, because that's where they fund. You've got to be able to segment thousands of funders and in a sophisticated way, which is a marketing challenge. And then have those peer-to-peer outreach efforts by those lead funders. Imagine local markets. So you have your industry, your health, education, poverty. Imagine in every major urban city, if foundations have gotten together and said, hey, 20 of us are going to be the lead funder group, and we're going to share these with the other 300 funders in Atlanta or in Chicago or wherever it is. So when Teach for America wants to come to Atlanta and serve every kid, every school, and it takes 25 million, maybe a little bit less in one city, you've got the funders ready. This is a difference between the for-profit and the nonprofit capital markets. You really don't have this localization per se in the for-profit capital, but you do in philanthropy. Philanthropy is like politics. 90% of it is local. And then imagine clustering. It's really difficult to imagine making a difference in health unless you're touching on many sub-issues, say in health. Workforce, behavioral health, chronic care, environmental health, all kinds of different sub-issues in health. But that you are actually doing these with some sense of strategy of how they fit and integrate, so that you're not just banking on silver bullet solutions, that they're solutions that actually affect something else. So if you're trying to reform primary care, for example, your primary care docs, it's going to have a big impact on a mental health intervention that focuses on putting inside of primary care practices a mental health expert. And so a lot of these things intertwine, and right now everybody works in silos. But if they can start to cluster, then you really have an opportunity. So elements of a marketplace. None of that will take place unless the capital is there. So if you just think about the elements, you need investment standards. You have to have constant education and knowledge, because in the for-profit sector, people are kind of talking the same language. They go on a business school, et cetera. That doesn't exist. There's a huge educational piece. It's kind of a movement-building piece in this sector if we're going to get a capital marketplace built. Early adopting funding community. You need hundreds of funders who get it. Now, over the last 10 years that we've been involved in this, really 8 years, I think we're there. I think we have those funders. They weren't there 8 years ago. You need high-quality deal flow. You need something to invest in. You need lead funders, and you need large-scale distribution. The large-scale distribution is just another way of saying you've got to be able to bring this to thousands of funders. Does it seem like pie in the sky? Does it seem too ambitious? Yes. So it's damn hard, and that's why it hasn't happened. One organization can't set it up. It's so hard that it really takes the kind of I would call it entrepreneurial idiocy. Don't quote me on that. But it's that entrepreneurial spirit where, against all odds, you just continue to bang against the challenge. And I'm going to tell you that it's very possible. Because here's what's in place. When we started our work 8 years ago, we envisioned this, but it's been 8 years, and in the last 5 years, where we built a national association. It's got about 5,000 members now. About a third of those are funders of different sorts. And they include, by the way, corporations, investment banks, wealth managers who manage the money of philanthropists, big foundations, small, medium-sized. Because we knew it takes an industry sector approach if we're going to get this done. And here's what's in place. Investment standards have been agreed upon to evaluate and assess these opportunities, and criteria for what kinds of investments would qualify, including that you have to have a business plan. And you have to have evidence by a third party. Doesn't have to be quite a randomized controlled trial, but third party, a randomized control trial is what the Food and Drug Administration does, or if you're studying cancer and you do a trial, if you're not familiar with it. But you have to have third party evidence that your program works. So they've agreed on those standards. They've also agreed on what kinds of investment materials. A critical piece of the for-profit capital markets. You can't go out with a prospectus unless it has certain information in it. It's illegal. Education and knowledge. We now have multiple educational venues, including a national conference, and others who are promoting education around, and here's the term in the sector now, scaling what works. There are other associations that have picked up on it. The Obama administration has a big fund called Social Innovation Fund, which is essentially that. Education Department has done their version of this. The Department of Labor, it's catching on. Early adopter funding community. Within our association, there are hundreds and hundreds of funders who are now open to this. We've created lead funder groups. So in education and in health, they have 25 to 30 funders, the major foundations. You can go to the socialimpactexchange.org, major funders. They've agreed on all these standards. They have nominated 20 investments for their first round. They've selected 5 in education and in health. They have, with our staff, started to make the connections to these thousands of other funders through the networks that already exist across the country. And we're going to bring these investments out later this year, before the end of the year, with 1/3 of the money already attached. So the big test comes next, which is whether or not funders who are not part of that lead funding group will co-fund. Are we there? We're a long, long way from there, from being the vision being there. Just give you a couple of other things that really need to happen, and this is 10, 15-year process. The way foundations are structured, it's not for collaboration. So we're just, in essence, unless they change their structures, we can all go home if we think we're going to solve social problems, unless you want the government to do everything and the government doesn't have any money left to do everything. So foundation structures do need to evolve. Things like chief collaboration officers and this training to actually figure out how to do co-investments for their program officers, and not making 159 grants, each of $50,000. But being able to reserve some of your grants for big investments of $1 or $2 million for scaling. Funder incentives. Right now, in the for-profit sector, everybody has the same incentive to make money, give or take. There are others who care about value to society, and so that's quite important. But there's a universal that you're trying to make money. The incentives should be for impact in the social sector. But in truth, there are lots of other incentives. Self-gratification, your own credit, things that don't necessarily compute to helping the people who need to be helped. And so we need to create better incentives, even pay incentives, right, for those working in foundations. There are lots of other incentives. We need to build further standards. I think really the key is leadership, institutions and individuals. Leaders in these foundations, we have these working groups. We don't have all the CEOs of Gates and Ford and Rockefeller sitting at the table and saying, hey, we're going to reorganize and we're going to carve out $100 million a year for this, guaranteed. We really need leadership where leadership says, and the pledge billionaires and others who say, look, we're going to take a stand and we're going to make sure that we're not putting all of our dollars into necessarily scaling things that work, but a good chunk of them. I really think that leadership will be the key over time to see a marketplace develop. So almost in closing, so what can you do? If you care and if you want to be involved, there are so many ways to do it. Look, some of you, but probably not that many, will start out in careers in philanthropy. But that doesn't matter. In any walk of life and profession, whether you're in business, whether you're in engineering or medicine, you'll have opportunities to engage and get involved and participate, and that's just by far the most important thing. First of all, you'll give your own money away. Secondly, you'll have opportunities to join committees. Third, you might be on the committee that decides how Chase Manhattan gives some of their money away. They ask for employee participation in those kinds of things. You may be in government. You may be blessed enough later in your careers to jump into the philanthropy sector or be a philanthropist. However you go about it, don't sit on the sidelines. I guarantee you that our prosperity is intertwined, that everybody's got to do their part. That is the essence of a democracy. You've got to give and participate to the whole. When you do that, don't reinvent. Yes, you may fund the breakthrough innovations, terrific. But fund in part what works. Don't reinvent the wheel. 3 lessons. Don't reinvent. Collaborate, because you just can't get it done on your own. Might seem more easier and more fun sometimes, but I actually think collaborating when it works is more fun. And third, think about systems. Systems change, I think, is the strongest lever of change. Right? So think about systems change, not just working in a silo. In essence, it's all about responsibilities, but it's also an opportunity. It changes your life, changes the lives of the people you help. It's gratifying, but it actually changes your life by just getting involved and being engaged. But keep those things in mind. Don't reinvent, fund what works, collaborate, and think about systems. And then, I don't know if does anybody know what this image is? That's right. And so someone who knows Sisyphus, would you explain the myth of Sisyphus to everybody? All right, I'll do it. So it's a Greek myth. Oh, go ahead. So, yeah.
Basically, he has to roll this boulder up every day, and at the end of the day, he starts over, and he does it for eternity.
That's right. That's a pretty bad eternity. So unless we work together, society will keep being Sisyphus in essence. I mean, this is what we've done. If you just look at the history of education in this country in the last 50 years and lots of other areas, unless we work together, take the things that work, and really collaborate to move them out to the millions of people who need them, we're just going to be Sisyphus. But if everybody works together, we don't have to be. So I'll just leave that image up there. And that concludes the remarks, and I thank you. And any questions are, of course, very welcome.
So the question is, if it's a profit, right? For profit, we can measure it with the how much profit that particular investment is. But for non-profit, how is that metric? How is it measured? The success of all this program or system? How do you measure them?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and you also reminded me to mention that there's a whole field of social purpose organizations that are not nonprofits, that they're kind of hybrid organizations. They are for-profits, but they're not trying to maximize their profits. They're actually trying to do some good, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the question was, how do you measure the effectiveness of nonprofits? The for-profit sector, obviously everybody's looking at the bottom line and ROI, et cetera. There are ways to measure the effectiveness of nonprofits, and yet it's not as sophisticated yet as the for-profit sector. So you can pick different metrics, right? So number one, you have to measure, okay? And if people are really interested, go to an organization called MDRC, which is one of the leading valuation firms in this sector. Number one, you have to measure, and you measure against baselines. But when you measure, I mean, you can measure outputs to see if your operations are working well, right? If you've got no kids in your program and you have no tutors and you're only tutoring 10 hours or something, those are all outputs. You're probably not going to be doing a good job. So you want to make sure that your classes are robustly attended and you're delivering a certain amount of hours that you think makes sense. But at the end of the day, what you're measuring are things like gains in reading proficiency. So you actually have to take a baseline measure of when those kids, each single one of them, come in and where they're at in their reading proficiencies, and then see where they are at the end of 12 months. Or now we have the technology actually to much more iteratively see how they're doing and calibrate those instructional lessons. That's not enough, though, because you've got to measure that against the counterfactual. The counterfactual is, well, what would happen if those kids did not join the reading program? Is there another reading program down the street? So it might be redundant. You may not need it. It's just as good, maybe even better. Are these kids that basically, because of their situation at home, would already learn to read at that pace? So what you really need is a control group. You take similar set of kids, and you measure them in that program versus another set, and we're not getting the intervention. And then at the end of the day, you want to actually measure two programs against each other, just like you measure same-store sales of Gap versus same-store sales of Old Navy or something. We're not near that yet because we don't have the comparative benchmark data. Right? There are some efforts to create that. They're going to be probably decade-long efforts, but you can definitely, and if you want to look at a nonprofit and say, do I want to volunteer there? Do I want to give money? Ask them, are you measuring where the kids are at when they come in? Are you measuring where they're at when they finish a year, and how does that compare to whether or not if they didn't get the intervention at all? You can do that in many walks. I mean, there are a whole set of safety net programs, and you're not going to measure whether if you're giving food to people who are hungry, it has impact, right? That we call it just self-evident, right? There you want to measure: are you doing it in a high quality way? Are you certifying the food? Is it not rancid? Are you doing it efficiently? Cost to serve. Those are other metrics. But for a lot of these core issues, right, are people actually moving out of poverty? There's a wonderful program that gives loans to single working poor moms. So it turns out daycare and a car are the two leading factors that help you move out of poverty. A car allows you to go to work, get a job, right, and be able to take your kids to health care or whatever it is, or even the daycare. Well, there's a $20 billion predatory lending field that preys upon people who don't have credit, these single working poor moms. And so they're paying 30-40% interest at predatory car lots. Their cars are lousy. It just puts them more into debt, right? Versus there are programs out there that will give them a loan, screen them, give them a loan, 7-8% because they want it to be real. 90+% of them repay the loan. Their credit scores go up. They open a bank account for the first time. Their income goes up 45%. They start to move out of poverty. They take their kids to daycare. That can be scaled because that program is self-sustaining, because in essence, it could be a for-profit. They wouldn't make a lot, and they're a nonprofit, right? Because they have 8% interest on their loans, right? If you get enough of those loans, right, it's kind of like micro-lending. So you're measuring, are they moving out of poverty? What was their income when they went in? They go to the program. What's their income, a year, 2 years, 3 years later? What's happening to their credit scores, which is key for them to join the mainstream banking world, right? These things are imminently doable, scalable, if we would care enough about that which works and actually changing people's lives for the better. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer to the question of measuring. Sorry for that long-winded.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I read some articles about the overhead costs for some of the larger nonprofit organizations, for example, like Red Cross, and they even say some of the division, they have like 40% over costs, and then goes into operational and administrative charges. So that kind of had for me, the question is to have your idea of scaling up. But if this overhead becomes a main issue, to have a large distribution, then that will eat up, even if you had the best model in implementing something, but if the overhead cost of the organization, nonprofit, is not being lowered, then the efficiency and the efficacy will still be suffered. So I just want to ask you, how would your model tackle that kind of existing problem?
No, it's a great question, and it's a question that's batted around philanthropy a lot. So I don't get too long-winded. There are a couple of dimensions of that. I'm just going to make a note. So the basic overhead question is a myth, largely. If you're going to take that which works and really scale it up and spread it, then you have to invest in the infrastructure to do that. When people say overhead, they're counting everything that doesn't go to helping that child in that classroom. But again, it's a misnomer. If you really want to take something that works and put it in 500 cities and affect 5 million kids, you have to invest in the distribution mechanism to do that. You have to invest in the quality control. You know how much money GE spends on quality control each year with their Six Sigma? Billions. Right? I mean, because they understand that you have to deliver quality. Marketing, right? Even fundraising, until you get to a point where you're more sustainable, and I do want to talk about that. So you've got to invest in the infrastructure that can deliver at scale with quality. Those two, at scale with quality. Let me tell you, it's worth it to society to spend an extra $1,000 per child if they actually learn to read and graduate and have the skills to contribute so that they're not on the public assistance programs. If you don't graduate from high school or you become pregnant in high school, those are the two leading corollary factors to being on public assistance. A digression. So from the infrastructure standpoint, if you're Microsoft, you know how much money you're piling into the infrastructure of building your software? Right, so you've and then the plants, et cetera. The big race at Google is, you know, who's going to build all the server capacity and, right, and also recruit talent, right? People don't like to pay for talent, right? But the companies know you've got to pay for the best talent, right, to succeed. So people get upset at nonprofits for paying for great talent. Right? It doesn't make sense. It's a double standard. So don't look at overhead as a singular metric. Often it's misleading. And I say often, right? Because there's an important caveat here. What you want to look at is this intervention succeeding in what it's doing? And then, as it scales up, right, you want to look at its cost per person served compared to others, because that rolls in all the costs, right? So if a KIPP school is a charter school is delivering at, you know, the same as a public school per child, right? $14,000 or whatever it is in Atlanta versus, you know, KIPP at $13,500, but KIPP does a better job, then, you know, then you should be realizing you're getting same cost but more impact. As you scale up, you'd think you'd get economies of scale. But with direct service, it's not necessarily true. With products, it is. So software, sure. You do the software, you do the vaccine, you know, once, you pile in a lot of money or a new drug into the R&D. But with direct services, management consulting or other things, in the for-profit sector, it's the same thing. You don't get that many economies of scale because you have to serve each student. You get some, so you should look, as you scale these organizations up, what's happening to their back office infrastructure, and is it becoming more efficient? So there are certain metrics that should, you know, go down in terms of scale and size. Look, there is a caveat here. As any organization becomes large, institutional, and entrenched, Red Cross and others, a lot of them do wonderful work, but it's just that the nature of organizations have been around for 100 years. It's hard to be nimble, right? You know, people are not paying them a lot to, you know, streamline, right? You know, so when these very large organizations have been around a long time, yeah, that's a very legitimate thing to take a look at. But don't look at it as you think about investing and scaling things up, because you've got to invest in the infrastructure to do it. I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Hey, I have a question for you. So I saw on the paper that you work at the for-profit sector at first, and then you changed to the nonprofit sector. So what do you think is your greatest achievement in the nonprofit sector that you think you cannot achieve in the for-profit sector? Because I feel like just give other people incentive to actually join the nonprofit sector instead of going to make money or something.
Yeah, no, that's right. And first out of college, I worked at a marketing firm for a little while, but then I started a nonprofit. Then I went into the for-profit for a long time, and then back to the nonprofit. My motivations are different than yours, because everybody's motivations are different. I always felt I would be in the nonprofit sector, or maybe the government sector, because to me, just the most important thing is to leave the world a better place than when you come in. And I may not have delved in to the degree that I have had I not felt that as it came together, the model of what we started to try to do, I thought would have the largest possible impact that I could make on society. Others can make other and bigger impacts, but this is what I felt I could do to make the largest possible impact. And so I'll be the first to tell you that it's hard to compare. I mean, we funded companies, and sure, we developed things that, you know, people bought and things like that in the for-profit sector, and I consulted companies and hopefully helped them to succeed better, and that helps their employees, and it just helps society, no question about it. But here, I think we have the potential to change the lives of millions in a way that is different than providing somebody with a better iPod or a better, piece of insurance, which is not to denigrate that, because those are not unimportant things. But I feel we have the potential to change the lives of millions of people, give them an opportunity just to succeed in life based on their own hard work and merit. When you have that many strikes against you coming into this world, I just think it's patently unfair. I mean, the biggest philanthropists will tell you, most all of them, that are most honest, will say, look, I won the lottery because I was just, I wasn't born rich necessarily, but some of them were, but I was born into a wonderful family. I had great role models. I gave them all the opportunities, right? So many don't have that, and just for me, it motivates me to try and do that. I'll be the first to tell you that while I think we've done some good and we've raised capital or helped certain organizations raise capital, the vision is not accomplished yet. So ask me in 10 years, or come help us, and maybe we'll do it together, and then I would feel really able to say that nothing compares. Right now, it's the potential for that, and that's enough for me for now.
Is this on? Hi, I actually work at the Foundation Center, and our mission is to aggregate and distribute data on foundations. And one thing, just coming in from a nonprofit perspective, nonprofits typically don't like paying for evaluation, mainly because in the eyes of a nonprofit, it's non-essential. And honestly, a lot of funders don't pay for proper evaluation. They ask for outputs rather than outcomes. So my question is, what are you doing to encourage funders to invest specifically in evaluation, and how are you educating them to properly support nonprofits in that area?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it ties to the question the gentleman had here. So to tell you what we're doing, and it's not enough, and it takes leadership, but in those lead funder groups, what we have suggested is they may want to have a pot of money. Those lead funders put in money depending on each deal. So it's not that they put money into a fund. If they like a particular nonprofit scaling plan and it fits with what they do, they put money in. But we have suggested, put a little fund together so you have a few $1 million, and then each year you can do 8 or 9, you can fund 8 or 9 evaluations. Obviously outcomes evaluations. Other things we're doing. They haven't agreed to that yet. But it's on the table, and I think it'll happen. In our national conference, our annual conference, we focus a ton on the discussion of evidence and how you can look at evidence, how you can gather evidence. And I think that foundations are starting to fund more of these, the bigger foundations, the Robert Wood Johnsons of the world, the Gates Foundations. They are starting to do more of it. What's more important, I think, is the nonprofits, at least the ones that we deal with, the ones that are trying to scale their effective interventions, are realizing that it is hard. They don't know what the results are going to be, but they know that it's a key trigger, beginning to become a trigger for money to flow to them, because there is this growing group of funders who are looking for evidence-based effective interventions. We're not quite there yet. I wouldn't say we've hit a tipping point, but I think we're getting pretty close. There's a dozen nonprofits over the last year or two that have made the decision. They're going to do the evaluation. Some of them are very expensive, some are not. And it has been a trigger point for them to start their growth capital campaign. So we are trying to do it through education, through our conference, through these lead funding groups. We know some of the people at the Foundation Center in New York, and we would be happy, because this is it's got to be a collaborative effort. We'd be happy to engage in an exploration of how to do that, on a larger basis, how to encourage it on a larger basis, because it's key. Yeah.
So much of your model seems to me to be based on rational assumptions, whereas a lot of the social problem arena is fraught with emotion and ideology. For example, in the US, we have 5% of the world's population. We imprison 25% of the world's we have 25%
World's incarcerated.
of the prisoners. There's evidence that drug courts are a great diversion. Rand Corporation did an incredible report on return on investment, and then you get the when the bill comes up again for legislation in California, they let the corrections officers union say, no more, drug courts are not going to be, required. And so here you have an incredible evidence, yet we have ideology and intolerance and stuff like that really can mitigate the rationality. So my question to you is, what's the kind of bounded rationality that we need to be prepared for as we think of a capital market for philanthropy?
I'm sorry, you said bounded?
The boundaries of a bounded rationality.
Yeah.
You know.
Look, you can't de-emotionalize this work. It wouldn't be feasible, nor would it be productive. So. But emotion can be a double-edged sword, right? So when you think about, I'll just step back. When we think about emotion, we're really not very interested in fighting for fighting's sake. And what I mean by that is ideology for ideology's sake. We're going where the evidence is. Now, if there's evidence that something works, then throw every single last ounce of passion you have into making sure as many people as possible receive that intervention. That includes advocacy. That includes policy change and political battles. That includes every last thing you need to do, because you know that's going to change the lives of lots and lots of people. That passion drives everything. We're human. It also drives philanthropy. So everybody says, well, philanthropists and funders are not giving their money because you give them evidence that something works. And that's actually true. In many respects, they give based on their emotions. Now, foundations less so, because they're institutional and they're supposed to analyze things more than philanthropists. But let's use it. Because all of these interventions that really work, the one I told you about that lends money to single working poor moms, they have the best stories also. Use those stories. And add to that the evidence that it really works. You have a very powerful combination where you're building on passion. And then when it comes to the ideological battles, we try and stay out. Because I think evidence is the sort of the Occam's edge, right? It cuts through it all and says, this is cross aisle. You should get behind this because it is evidence. I don't care if you've had battles in the past with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. If we can agree that this works, it should de-ideology it, whatever. And then, you put every last ounce of passion you have behind it. So take out the ideology passion, bring all the passion behind what works. It's just kind of I don't know if that's helpful.
Alexander, we have one last.
Yeah, whatever. And you can always, actually have a flight to catch, but if you catch me before I run, be happy to.
Thanks. How do you plan to handle disinvestment in your market, right? So how do you plan to stop funding a project that you thought sounded great, but that fails?
It's no secret that the philanthropic sector has difficulty cutting off funding for nonprofits or programs that actually don't work. And I'm not a big believer in a quick hook. I am a believer in course adjustments and giving, just like companies. Companies reinvent themselves a lot, right? That's different from the core intervention, sort of having some evidence that it's working, right? If you're funding something that just has no history of working ever at all, then why are you funding it? And yeah, a lot of people would say that about 2 million nonprofits, we really should have, a lot less than half of that. because we're spreading our money out too much. So we do have to do a better job of stopping funding things that don't work, because if we think of all this as capital allocation, you only have a limited pot of capital. This country has a limited pot of capital, the world, so you can't be allocating capital to things that don't work consistently. So on that level, you've got to be able to shift to things that do work. Now, if you're implementing something that should be working, and this happens a lot. There's a lot of studies that show that this particular teen pregnancy program works, but when you try to scale it up to 1,000 programs, it's not meeting its outcome measures. I wouldn't pull the hook, but you've got to really delve in there, and maybe it's kind of a turnaround, maybe it's a quality control issue. So different sides of that issue depending on where an organization is. If nothing's working and it's never worked, either shouldn't be funded, or and I'm not talking about safety net kinds of things, or you've got to stop funding it. Other things that show that they're effective but are having trouble, no, you've got to really work with them and be patient, capital, because this work is not easy. There is a corollary here to sustainability. Philanthropy's pot is limited, and so you can't philanthropically fund so many things if you're going to get anything to real scale, or a consistent amount to real scale. But you're trying in these organizations, sort of related to the question from before, you're trying, when they start to get to scale, that they have some revenue models. So if it's a tutoring program, the schools, through their school budgets, are paying for it. Or if it's the car lending program I mentioned, they're getting interest back from the people who are buying the car, right? But there are different revenue streams that should make these organizations much more sustainable, so they're not relying entirely on grants and philanthropy. So that helps them in this model from relying entirely on philanthropy, and instead being able to say, okay, if you're running into some trouble, we're going to help you, but thank God you've got some revenue streams of your own, to bank on, if that's helpful.
Alex, I just want to, Alexander, sorry, pardon me, I want to thank you for coming.
Alex is fine.
And if I could get a warm round of applause for Alexander.
Thank you. Good luck.